we have 4 presentations. The first presentation is from Tadayuki Matsumuri from Hitachi, Empathetic Active Inference with Empathy Mechanism for Socially Behaved Artificial Agent. You can begin your presentation. I will send you a small reminder 2 minutes before the end.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you great.
Thank you. Hello, I'm Tadayuki Matsumura. In this presentation, I will present the socially behaved artificial agent. The motivation of this work is a problem of AI ethics. Currently, explicit rules such as laws and regulations are developed for them. Behind these ideas, it is assumed that the environment is predictable and AI is perfectly controllable tools. These type of AI ethics are important. However, these assumptions can limit the potential of AI. In this work, we try to make the other type of ethics of AI through making artificial agents that can behave as like humans living in unpredictable environment with making a society. In this research, we use active inference for the basis of the behavior model. Active inference is a concept proposed in the free energy principle, which is a hypothesis that various human activities, such as perception or action, can be explained in a unified mechanism. In the FAP, our cognitive activities are explained by such that, firstly, we have internal models for predicting surrounding environment, and secondly, we always try to minimize the free energy of the model. Free energy is defined by this equation, and it intuitively represents prediction errors or uncertainties. The interesting point of the active inference is that the internal model infers not only the hidden state, but also actions for the agent. That is, the action to be taken is the action which minimizes the free energy of the agent. This is the idea of the active inference. Intentional actions also can be explained in the active inference. In this case, we consider expected free energy, which is free energy for the future state when a certain action is taken. When considering march time step ahead, expected free energy at march time step ahead is considered as described in the right figure. Based on the expected free energy for each action, the distribution of the action is determined such that the smaller the expected free energy, the higher the probability of selection. When we consider intentional behavior, intentions are considered as preference of future observation, and rewards according to the future observation are encoded in the first term of the expected free energy. We extend this active inference to generate a social behavior. The idea of the extension is explained using a simple situation in which there are two agents called I and other. The agent called I is the subject of action in this explanation. The agent under the active inference makes prediction about the environment and takes some action to minimize the prediction errors. In this figure, I predicts future behavior of the other because the other is an environment for me. Namely, I act to reduce my prediction errors. So far, this is a standard active inference. Here, if we consider that the other is also a biological agent, we can assume that the other also act under the active inference. In this case, we can assume that the other also predicts the future of behavior of me, and the other try to reduce the prediction errors about me. In this understanding, we notice that our actions can reduce not only our own free energy, but also that of the other. If I can predict others' prediction for me, I can act to reduce the free energy of the other. In other words, we can extend free energy principle and active inference from an individual idea to a collective idea. Namely, the agent imaginarily shares a brain, and they try to minimize the free energy of the shared brain. To reduce the free energy for the shared brain is to act not only for me, but also for the others. Because of this, we expect that the idea can be used to generate social behavior, which is a behavior for others. To realize this idea, it is necessary to predict others' prediction about myself. This is implemented based on the mirror system and simulation theory, a hypothesis for the mechanism of empathy. In the mirror system and simulation theory, it is said that we understand others by simulating others by own bodies. Here, we consider the idea of using our own body to simulate others as using our internal model to infer others' predictions. The overview of the mechanism is described in the figure. The agent has internal model to predict future observation for his own observation. Moreover, we use the same internal model to predict others' prediction about myself. Although the model is the same, the input to the model is changed to the observation of the others. For this, the process of inferring the observation of others is included. For example, when the observation is an image, novel view synthesis, which is the method for generating images from different viewpoints, can be used. In addition, as we will discuss in the following evaluation, if the observation is the location of the agent, a simple coordinate transformation can be used. As with the encoding of intentional behavior, we add the term to the first term of the expected free energy. That is the intention to respond to the expectation of others. If there are multiple others, the sum for each other is considered. We evaluated the proposed method using the control task of an autonomous mobile agent. In the evaluation, multiple agents move to each target point. The shortest paths of each agent intersect each other, and agents are required to take collision avoidance behavior. The player, it is a red agent, is controlled by the proposed method, and the others are controlled by the social force model, SFM. SFM is a simple social working model. Roughly said, SFM is a dynamic model in which the walking speed is determined by two forces. The first one is driving force to a goal, and the second one is repulsive force from others. In this evaluation, the weight of these two types of forces are changed to evaluate two types of others, selfish and altruistic. This is an example of the behavior of others under the control of the SFM. The player red circle randomly moved, and the other green and blue and orange moved with SFM. The top picture is an example for selfish others, and the bottom picture is an example for an altruistic others. As you can see from the figure, when others are altruistic, the other will take the path which has more margin with others. The setup for the player is simply described. The action space is defined in discrete space, movement for 5 direction, and weight current position. A simple VA-like model is used to the internal model, and the model is trained with the offline manner. The model is used to predict the expected free energy for each action. First, the evaluation result when there is only one other besides the player are shown. As a comparison, we also show the result of the standard active inference case. The 2 figures to the left when the other are selfish. In this case, the player with the standard active inference moves straight to the destination because the player acts optimally only for its own purpose. On the other hand, the proposed agent moves to avoid the others as well as the other because the player predicts that the other expects the player to avoid collision and the player tries to respond to it. As a result of taking this detour path, the sociality of the behavior is increased. Namely, the travel distance of the player increased compared to that of the standard active inference case. At the same time, the travel distance of the others decreased and the minimum distance between the player and the other increased. In addition, the inequality of the difference in the travel distance decreased. Next, the case where others are altruistic is shown on right side. In this case, the same tendency is observed, but the player moved a path with larger margin to the others. These results indicate that the proposed agent can behave in social manner that are beneficial to the other, even if the results are disadvantageous to itself. An important point is that the difference of the behavior does not depend on any reward designing, as in reinforcement learning. Namely, the sociality depends on the character of the other around the player. The other around the player teach appropriate behavior for the player. In the case where 3 others besides the player, a similar result were observed in the altruistic other case. Namely, the travel distance of the player is increased compared to the standard active inference, and that of others are decreased. And the minimum margin is increased, and inequality of the travel distance is decreased. On the other hand, in the case of selfish others, a collision occurred. It may be due to high density in the center point when all of agents are selfish, including the player. Even in this case, the proposed agent can avoid collision by waiting the crossing of the others. In this case also, there is no design of reward or penalty. Social behavior realized by responding to the other's expectation to the player. Finally, I would like to conclude by organizing the proposed method in terms of AI asks. The proposed method firstly run internal model to predict the future behavior of others, and the same model is used to predict others' expectation about me, and the agent try to respond to it. These processes make a cyclic process, and it encourages the agent to behave like surrounding others. To behave like surrounding others is the concept of the AI asks in this work. The others are teacher for social behavior. We consider that this highly abstracted definition of asks can be widely applied to the problem of AI asks. This is our future work. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your presentation. So I would like to ask for questions from everyone. You can share your questions in the chat. So I would like to ask a first question. I found it very interesting how you described this social behavior that does not need to use explicit objectives on the learning. I found that was a very good property of your method. My question is, here you showed this applying to this movement. Have you considered other sorts of tasks and how difficult, how easy they would be to do using your method?
Sorry, I can't understand the question.
Today you presented the task of walking, walking and not colliding. Have you considered other tasks that could use a similar model?
Oh, I think the proposed method is very abstracted, so a wide range of problem can be applied to the proposed method. For example, I have never evaluated or consider in detail, but for example, language task for fairness can be solved by the proposed method. I think just idea.
All right, thank you very much. We have a question from the chat. James Borg asks, how easily could this method be exported to real robotics? And how does this work relate to the theory of mind?
How easily could this method? How easily could this? At first, the second question, the theory of mind is inspired the proposed method, and so theory of mind is related to the proposed method. And the first question, how easy could this method? For applying the real environment task, such as robotic task, I think it is difficult because running the internal model for robotics task is very difficult due to high dimension of observation information or difficulty in sampling the training data. So in real case, it is difficult. There are some problem I have to solve.
All right. Okay. We have a thank you very much. We have a raised hand by Kasper Stoy. So Kasper, would you like to ask your question?
Yes, thank you for the talk. I was just wondering what happens if the setup is not symmetrical. So now the agents always circle around to the right, but there are situations where you have two agents coming and one have to go left and the other has to go right. What happens in this situation in your method?
Yes, it is a very good question. And if you have interesting, please read my proceedings. There is a unsymmetrical case, and the result is not good for this person compared to this presentation. Okay, my answer is okay.
Oh, I think Kasper we're losing you, Kasper.
Huh?
I think maybe he had a connection problem. Well, we are about out of time. I just want to read the question of Seth, but I don't think we have time for it.
Fine.
So can multiple agents learn to work together to deal with one selfish agent without just letting the selfish agent wins? So unless if you have a very quick question answer, or okay, so let's move on and carry this on for Slack. Thank you very much, Tadayuki
you very much.
Matsumura, for your presentation,
Thank you.
and thank you everyone for the questions. I would like to move to the next talk. So David, if you would like to come up.
Yeah, sure. Just can you see me and hear me?
I can see you, but I cannot see your screen. So maybe you would like to share.
Give me a second.
Yes.
So now you should be able to see my screen.
Yes, you can start Okay, now that's fantastic. So the next talk is by David Harrell, Dominika Zoratova, Matej Kripne, and Thomas Mikolov, Emergence of Novelty in Evolutionary Algorithms. So feel free to start.
Thank you for the introduction. So as you said, I am David Harrell, the main author of this paper, which I would like to present to you. It's called Emergence of Novelty in Evolutionary Algorithms. Even though evolutionary algorithms are inspired by biological evolution, they do not behave the same. After a while, you can see that they stop evolving. After some time, all the population converges to non-evolving population, and this is not what we really observe in the nature. Reliance on fitness function is believed to be the problem. This fitness function measures progress towards the objective, but if we optimize this fitness function, it often leads us to local minima, which is obviously not good. So the question is how to overcome this problem, how to mitigate this, and there were several approaches how to do it. And one of the most famous ones is from Ken Stanley. It's called novelty search. In this algorithm, we completely ignore the objective, we ignore the fitness function, and instead we measure the novelty of each agent, and we want to like maximize this novelty. So we will reward most novel agents most. So, but we thought that this is not what we really observe in the nature. In the nature, we don't have anyone who judges how novel we are, who says you are novel, you are not. There is like no one who measures how novel each individual is. So instead, we thought that it's rather the environment which rewards and motivates the agents to be different. So we can see it as like that novelty can emerge as a byproduct of individuals interacting with the environment. And this is exactly what inspired us to our approach, which we called sugar search. And the most easiest and simplest implementation of this thought is simple. We just randomly distribute the sugars or rewards over the environment, and the first agent who collects this sugar will receive a reward. So this is like the basic idea behind our approach, and we decided to compare it to novelty search on the same task as novelty search was compared. And these tasks are from Ken Stanley. These are like maze navigation tasks, as we can see on the picture. So we can see the medium map on the left side and hard map on the right side. The goal for the agent is to develop such neural network which will navigate the agent from starting point, which is a red dot, to the ending point, which is represented as a green rectangle. So in the medium map, the agent, in order to solve this task, this maze, he needs to develop some kind of wavy movement to get through. This can be solved by a basic fitness-based evolution, but In the heart map, the situation is different. And we can see that there is a dead end in this corner. And if we actually optimize the fitness function, the whole population of the agents will get stuck in this corner. And this is true because you can see the results of the experiments. We run the fitness-based evolutionary algorithms where you optimize the distance to the goal, and almost all of the agents, which are on the illustration represented as blue rectangles, will get stuck in this hard corner. So in order to mitigate this, we have our own approach, which I already described. It's the sugar search, and we completely ignore the objective. We don't care where the goal is. We just randomly distribute the rewards on the map, and the agent who collects the sugar first will be rewarded by increasing its fitness. So we can see the visualization of the heart map on the left side, and on the right side, it's the same map, but with the gray dots, which are representing the sugars. And if we have a look at the results of these experiments on the heart map, on the left side, we can see the novelty search and its animation of the last generation reaching the goal. So we can see the novelty search on average needs 237 generations to finish the maze. And you can see the animation below the score. And on the right side, you can see our approach, which is like simpler. And we only need 153 generations on average to reach the goal. So that's a quite good result. And we can have a quick look on the animation where we can see the blue rectangles moving, which are representing the agents, and they are collecting the sugars, but they don't have any information where the sugar is located. And once the sugar is collected, it is marked red, and no agent can collect it again. So if we have a look at the table with the results in the first row, we can see that fitness-based search will actually only solve the medium map because it doesn't contain any dead ends, but on the more complicated maps with local minima, it has a problem and it actually never solves the maze. Our sugar search is quite faster than a novelty approach, and we solve the maze in the most cases. We also experimented with the reward density because there is the question is, should we put sugar on each pixel or should it be more sparse? So from the experiments, we can see that putting sugar per pixel works the best. However, this is not suitable for high-dimensional tasks or continuous spaces. So we can also see from the graph that having sparse rewards works also very good. And even though our algorithm, sugar search, perform well on maze navigation tasks, we thought that we can extend this solution to the more advanced problems like Atari games, which are well known in the reinforcement learning community. However, in this transition to the Atari games, we faced several challenges. First of them was tracking the agent, because in this environment, we don't know any information about the agent location. We just see the screen and its pixels. So we need to manually locate the agent, which is computationally expensive. Thus, we try to modify our sugar search to overcome this problem. And this modification of sugar search we call pixel novelty. So in our algorithm, we rewarded agent for picking the sugar as first. But in this scenario, the reward agent for generating new set of pixels first. So if agents will generate some actions which will generate new unseen screen, he will receive a reward. So like this is the basic idea behind that pixel novelty. And it helps us tremendously because we no longer need to track the agent. So it accelerates the whole computation a lot. And if we jump into the results, we can see that our approaches like sugar search performs quite well, and it outperforms fitness-based search where it optimizes the score, which is like really good considering that we ignore the score and we just pick the sugars on the map. So that works surprisingly well. And we again outperform the novelty search. But the more interesting fact is that we are on par with some of the most known reinforcement learning algorithm, which is DQN. And in some cases, we are able to beat it. We can like also zoom in on the last row where we have Montezuma's Revenge, which was considered to be a hard problem. And with just putting the rewards on the map, we achieve a really good score. We are almost as good as the DQN. So in conclusion, we showed that this approach, putting randomly placing rewards on over the environment, performs surprisingly well, and it outperforms fitness-based search and novelty search on maze navigation tasks, and it's also a lot simpler and faster. The same can be said about Atari Games environment, where we modified sugar search slightly, and this modification also works quite well. And we are on par with with like this DQN reinforcement learning algorithms. So I think we showed that our hypothesis is valid, and really we can see it as a environment which formulates and motivates the agent for being different. And we can view this approach as like a great alternative to the existing approaches. That's the end of my presentation. I would like to thank Good AI and TreeCap for sponsoring our research. And again, thank you so much for the attention. It would be great if you have some question which you can ask me now or through the email. So yeah, that's all from me.
All right. Thank you very much, David. That was a very, very interesting talk. And we have several questions in the chat already. Before I just want to check. Russell Standish has his hand raised. So do you want to ask? For quite a while, do you want to ask a question?
Yeah, sorry, I did mean to raise my hand, but I went to raise my hand and I realized it was already raised. So, yeah, so the comment and question that I wanted to make on this was that when I initially looked at your algorithm, I thought, well, this is just standard diffusion, but I guess what you're doing is preventing diffusion back to where the system's already been. So in classical diffusion in 2 dimensions, I think it takes like a square root time to diffuse all the way across the system. So this will run quite a bit faster, I guess, probably almost linear time to reach the other end. Exactly. But my question was, how does this scale up to higher dimensional phase spaces? Because I would think this is probably highly effective in the 2-dimensional examples that you are discussing in your slide, but for higher dimensions, it may not work quite so well.
Yeah, exactly. Like that's a great question. You are right. Like if we like generalize this thing into high dimensional space, it no longer works as good as it could. But I think this is the problem also with the novelty search, in the high dimensional space, because there you optimize like the k nearest neighbors, and in high dimensional space it can be as problematic as our approach. So yeah, like we experimented with having like sports reward system, like but obviously it explodes in complexity in this high dimensional space. So yeah, it's quite problematic, and it does not work in high dimensional spaces as good as it works in 2D. So unfortunately.
All right. Going back to the chat questions, the first one we have from James Stovold. Can you please expand on how the agents decide how to move on the landscape?
Yeah,
so
yeah,
do they
sure.
have momentum of some kind? Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so each agent, unfortunately, well, let me check if I have the slide there. So each agent is, if you can still see my screen, each agent is represented by a neural network. So agent has several inputs. He knows how far he is from the goal, and he knows on which side is the goal. So the goal of agent is to develop neural network which will navigate him from starting point to the ending point. So he has like these 8 inputs, and we have like a recurrent neural network which is like fixed, and we mutate its weights until we find the right neural network architecture, which is like different than Ken Stanley does. He like uses a neat algorithm for developing this neural network, but we experimented with it and figure out that these having like recurrent neural network works better, and also we don't need so many hyperparameters. So we represent the agent as a neural network.
All right. Next, we have Eamon Harvey asking, the standard way of getting novelty in evolution is random mutation at a rate that may be tuned to a maximum below mutational meltdown, so error catastrophe. So have you compared these methods to this?
Well, I think like I try to use like some state-of-the-art like evolutionary algorithms with like a lot of these things which should like mitigate this problem of converging the population, but it did not have the same results as we observed with novelty search or with our approach. So from my experiments, at least, it seems that it does not work so good. But of course, maybe if I dived more deeper into this and play with it for more time, maybe I could get like better results. But with my time, I figure out that it does not work as good.
Seth Bullock has a very, very interesting question. So he asked about what's a task that makes this approach well, and what kinds of tasks it would not work well, and maybe dangerous environments. And I would also like to add to this question, like if the tasks have any influence on how you distribute the sugar in the landscape.
Yeah. Okay, so let me answer the first question first. So the question was, if there are some problems where it does not perform well, and there are problems where it does not perform well, and these problems are if you don't have like any obvious local minima, just optimizing the fitness is quite enough. So unfortunately, I don't have like any good picture there, but maybe on this like a game, it's a breakout game, you don't really have like some obvious local minimum. So if you just optimize for the score, it will work better than just collect the sugars. So in these cases where you don't have like obviously some dead ends or local minima, it does not perform so well. But for example, Montezuma Revenge has like these local minimas you need to like get from one point to another. So there it works good. And for the second question, it was if can you like remind me what was the question, please?
Yeah, yes. No, I think that's basically it. What kind of test would not work well, maybe in dangerous
yeah.
environments. But actually, I think I would like to move to the next presentation. We are about to run out of time. So thank you very much. There are still many questions on the Zoom chat. I would encourage everyone to continue this conversation on Slack. So thank you again, David, for the very interesting talk. And thanks
Thank
everyone
you so
for the
much.
questions.
Yeah, thank you.
Fantastic. Go to the next presentation. So I would like to thank you again. And thank you again, Lucas, for your presentation. And now I would like to move for the final presentation of this session. And the final presentation is from Thomas Smith, who is a professor at the University of Graz. And the presentation will be a recording. Thomas will be with us for the set questions in the end. But right now I'm going to share the video. Okay. So let me just image this. So I'm going to start the presentation momentarily. All right, Pastor Thomas, you can begin your presentation.
Hi to everybody out there. My name is Thomas Schmickel. I'm the supervisor of the Artificial Life Lab at the University of Graz. I'm going to present now work that I've done together with my PhD student Martin Stefanetz, which is the work that we've done on the 3D variant of the primordial particle system, also called PPS 3D. When we were finding our primordial particle system, we were actually looking for something completely different. For our EU project Kokoro, we were, for example, searching for a very simple shoaling algorithm that allows those underwater robots with their very limited sensor capabilities to behave a little bit fish-like, for example. And we were also looking for a simpler form, an even simpler form of the B-cluster algorithm, which is currently the simplest choice algorithm that is inspired by honeybees, choosing where they aggregate, on which location they preferentially meet each other, like you can see this here in a picture from our EU project, CCBF. So we wanted to further break that down and simplify those algorithms, maybe find an algorithm that can do both, basically. And we came up with self-propelled particles. And there you have particles that have an orientation and they have a certain place in a space, like you see here in the XY coordinate system, and they always move every time unit with a certain velocity, so they always have the same speed. And concerning their turning behavior, so how much they rotate left or right, this is depending on their neighborhood. There is a certain radius that they can sense other particles in, and in our PPS system, this is just divided into two halves. So each particle looks at two semicircles and counts how many neighboring particles are on the left and how many are on the right side. Overall, this gives also the total neighborhood size. And now the turning angle is determined by one simple differential equation. The current orientation is changed with a certain degree of rotation called alpha here, and a neighborhood size dependent degree of rotation called beta here. So this turning angle beta is multiplied with the neighborhood size, so it's dependent on the neighborhood size, and the sign, whether it is turning left or right, depends on the difference in the occupation of the two semicircles. So it sort of exploits an environmental potential, a density difference in the environment. And besides alpha and beta, which are constants, there is also the velocity, the radius, they are also constants here in this system. So it is a super simple system. It is also deterministic. There is no noise in it except the initial distribution of the particles, but during the runtime there is no noise. And this simple equation that you see here was then able to produce fascinating outcomes which had nothing to do with fish swarms, nothing to do with collective decision making in honeybees, or at least we didn't find those in there, but it was way more fascinating what came out of it, and it came to a total surprise for us. So when we start such a PPS with very specific parameters like an alpha of 180 degrees and a beta of 17 degrees, we see a very interesting behavior of those particles. They start from an initial random chaotic distribution. There is no other noise in the system, so everything is deterministic. But after a very short time, such structures emerge and they start to replicate and to cover, to conquer the overall habitat very quickly. And if you look at that, it somehow reminds one on bacteria that are replicating if you look under a microscope. And if you ask why are they colored in different ways, this is purely based on the local density. So you see the color scheme on the left side. So this is no artistic creativity of us. It's just coloring the particle density. And we made a video of that, which is on YouTube. It has almost 450,000 views so far. There were 2,300 comments almost by people who had their saying in it, and it's quite controversial, the discussion whether this is life or lifelike or has nothing to do with the emergence of life at all. It is a particle system, nothing more, nothing less. An interesting one in our opinion because it shows the emergent formation of higher order self-replicating structures, which we call spores and cell, and how spores and cell behave will be shown in a minute. So the goal was to now translate this into a 3D environment. In 2D, it's very simple. You can turn either left or right, but if you are in 3D, then you have three ways how you can turn because there are three axes to turn around. And we dropped the roll. This is not relevant, at least not so far for us. And we did rotations only along two axes, the pitch and the yaw change, how this is usually called. And what we did is straightforward, simple. We count now the particles not in semicircles, but in hemispheres. And we rotate the particle then considering the same equation around one axis and then make half of a step forward, so only half of the velocity. And then we do the very same after that and rotate. After that rotation, we again count in these two semicircles and now we rotate around the other axis and make the second half of the rotation. So we basically just perform the two-dimensional PPS two times in order to cover three-dimensional motion, and we do something like a Runge-Kutta integration by moving only half of a step. So this is really a very, very minimal adaptation towards the 3D environment. And now let's see if we see similar structures. So for example, when we look at the emergence of spores, which are very tiny packages of particles very close together, which can then become cells if they become large enough so they can grow out into cells. We see that also in the 3D environment. We can see then the emergence of a cell out of such a spore, so it can grow out into a spore. We can see that one cell divides into two spores, which then later can again then turn into two cells. But we also see the division of a cell into two cells without a spore in between. And we see the system is expanding, it's conquering again the whole habitat. So all of that, what we have observed in the two-dimensional PPS, we can also see in the three-dimensional one. Here you can see a short video about that conquering of the habitat, and you can see the 3D PPS in action. So it's a little bit more difficult to see because of the 3D effect, and the video needed to be speeded up a bit, but you can see that it creates similar structures and similar overall behaviors. So for the 2D PPS, we created another model, which is a macroscopic population-based model for cells and spores. All of that was published in our scientific reports article a few years ago. And you see that the structures in the system follow a logistic growth model quite well. And we did now a similar analysis for the 3D system in the short paper that we present here at the ALife conference. And you can see that also there the logistic growth models fit very well. So in our scientific reports paper, we called the PPS to be lifelike, And this led to some heavy discussion on YouTube with colleagues at conferences in many other occasions, whether we can call a system like that to be lifelike. Let's have a closer look at what's necessary for being alive. There are certain criteria always mentioned. There are different lists around, different definitions, but there is some sort of common core in there. For example, the ability to show homeostasis, to have metabolism, to grow, to have some sort of organization and structuring. Being able to reproduce is, of course, a core element there. And all of those are not isolated from each other because they affect each other. So, for example, in order to grow, you need to have metabolism because you have to grow from somewhat. And then in order to reproduce, you need probably to grow first so that you are capable of doing that. And then there are other aspects always mentioned, like, for example, adaptation and showing stimulus response behavior or things like that. So when we look at our system, we can check some of these aspects. Like, for example, there is clearly a structure and organization in those entities that we see. There is metabolism. They consume green isolated particles. They sort of eat them and they grow afterwards. What they do is they keep a certain number of particles over longer periods in certain positions, in certain areas. So there is some sort of homeostasis and they show clearly reproduction. We are not so sure about the factors like adaptation or stimulus response behavior, but we are also cannot exclude it. So maybe it's there. We still have to look for it. So I think we can call these structures to be lifelike. Finally, let me conclude. We managed to show that self-propelled particle systems with a simple rule can lead to self-replicating structures. We have found that they work synchronously and asynchronously updating. That doesn't matter. They can turn in an ordered or in an unordered manner. Doesn't matter. Noise does not really affect them. It rather helps them. And only with a very few adaptation, it was possible to carry it over to the 3D world. What would we like to do with it? We would like to discover even more properties in the system. We would like to see maybe those missing features of life, maybe they are still there, and the 1000 other things to do, which we never find time because this is more like a hobby project in my lab, as we are dealing usually with bees and robots and more physical stuff. And this is done just as a side project. And the purpose of this talk is to make you aware of it, so that you probably could also have a look into that interesting system. The paper comes with a longer video, which you can find on Zenodo, and I already mentioned the 2D version of the primordial particle system on YouTube. So probably see you there. Thank you for listening.
All right. Thank you. Thank you very much for the wonderful, wonderful video. So let's go check the questions in the chat. Just a second. And we have quite a few of them. So Jonathan Lowry, thank you for the nice talk. I was wondering about the effects of the sensor radius on the cluster formation. Do you have more or less clusters emerging as the sensor radius grow?
Yeah, so I think we can further reduce this system because the constant parameters that I showed you, I think at least one of them could be probably reduced because the whole system is driven by local densities. And if the rotation scales with the size of the neighborhood, like that's one coefficient, and then the radius is, the neighborhood is counted in a certain radius, these two are sort of connected. So you could probably express this by one single coefficient. This is one stuff that we would like to do to further reduce the system. And then you end up with similar structures, just smaller. But probably you cannot do this to the full extent. So obviously I think there is a range in which it still has to be in order to be operational. But also that I don't know. It's just like an assumption that we have. So we really stumbled over that. We find it extremely interesting, but we hardly find time for looking into that. It's not something that you get easily funded by a grant-giving agency. So if you build robots, easily funding. If you have systems like that, it's difficult to get funding and people then really focusing on it.
I have a very simple question before moving to the next one in the chat.
Yeah.
You showed some parameters that you showed the parameters that were interesting. I want just to know, like, how frequent are these? Like, do you have to test many parameters to find this interesting behavior, or do they come very easily?
So as I told, we wanted to get something completely different. So I was sort of programming that and trying out some stuff, and those that I showed here showed the most interesting behavior, and I more or less accidentally stumbled over it. And I remember that I've sent Martin Stefanetz, who is my my PhD student now, and in those days he was a master student or even bachelor. Martin is here. I remember still the email that I sent him, like it was in German, but you would translate it probably into holy shit as the subject of that email, because it came to such a surprise. So there was no systematic search, but then Martin made for the scientific reports paper a systematic search, and he found it's only a very small region that he called region of life, where these interesting behaviors happen. And then there is a vast space of parameters where also other stuff happens, also interesting, but maybe not as lifelike as those behaviors that we've seen here.
All right, thank you very much. We are kind of running out of time for the first session. So I would like to thank you for the great talk. There is still a few questions in the chat. Please bring those to Slack.
I would just like to say I put some links into the chat if people are interested.
Absolutely. Thank you. And thank you all for all the presentations. And this is the end of the first session.
Yes, good morning, everyone, or hello, good afternoon. I'll be chairing the next session. Thank you, Klaus. Thank you for the organizer for giving me this opportunity. And the first speaker of this session is Kasper Stoy with video recorded talk, but then he will be available for questions afterwards. So let me just share this with you. Hope you can all see the screen. There we go.
My name is Kasper Stoy, and I would like to present my paper towards computationally efficient evolutionary robotics here at the ALife 2022 conference. So just to start with the highlights, so we basically have in this paper two contributions to evolutionary robotics. First contribution is that we've made a GPU-based evolutionary robotics engine where all individuals are evaluated in parallel, completely in parallel. And the second contribution is that we show that we can reduce the evaluation time of each individual in the evolutionary process through the use of co-evolution. And the impressive result we get is that we can do a full evolutionary run in 0.5 seconds on a modest laptop. And then, of course, this is important because one of the challenges of evolutionary robotics is, of course, the time it takes to evolve individuals, and also the increased use of resources, computing power, and natural resources, which we can reduce the computation time. We, of course, make evolutionary robotics much more practical. So what are we evolving? Nothing fancy here. We are doing obstacle avoidance of a small mobile robot, sort of a canonical task, just chosen because it's a well-studied problem in the literature. Interestingly enough, we can see on the right the network architecture we use with the input units coming from the sensors and output units going to the motors, and then some recurrent units between the output nodes here. So what are the inside otherwise? We have a normal fitness function for obstacle avoidance that talks about V here is the speed, the average speed. Next term is the difference between the wheels, which should be as little as possible because we don't want the robot to spin in place. And the last I here is the max sensor input of any of the sensors, indicating that we want the robot to have as little sensor input as possible. So basically the fitness function says drive straight, don't turn, and don't be close to obstacles. So basically this is a standard fitness function for obstacle avoidance. And then we have parameters for our evolutionary process, population size 256, generations 500, mutations 0.02, crossover 0.6. And for the neural network, I just showed that before, but basically 5 sensor inputs, 2 bias inputs, 2 motor outputs, and 2 recurrent connections between the outputs and no hidden layers. So that gives us a genome of 222 floating point genes to represent this neural network in the evolutionary computation. And then the parameters we're interested in studying here is arena size. So the robot runs around in a large empty arena, and we'll see in the next experiments that will vary the size of the arena as part of the experiment. And then the second thing is the evaluation period. So the time we let each robot be evaluated inside the arena is also a parameter we'll look at in this study. So if we just run a standard evolutionary algorithm and we do it in a environment which has a side length of 1 meter, it works very nicely, and we can quickly see that it converges on a good solution and finds the solution to the problem. An example result here is that we can see the robot starts here where the area indicates, and then it'll go towards the wall, turn, go to the other wall, turn, go to the final wall, turn, and then the evaluation period is over. So this is an example of a successful behavior. So if we look at it in terms of our parameters, we can see here on the header, we have the size of the arena. So as the side length of the arena goes up, we go out here, so all the way up to an 8 meter side length arena. And if we go down on the y-axis, it's the time that we evaluate individuals. So basically, for the last column row here, we let the robots evaluate for 400 seconds. And then in the middle, we can see the success of the robots under these conditions. And basically, the trend is pretty clear. If we have relatively small arenas where the robot is likely to encounter the wall, it kind of can learn the task, and also if it has long evaluation times, again increasing the chance that it actually hits an obstacle and therefore is able to learn from this experience. So basically, success is given if we have a small arena and for long evaluation times. And the success here is that even for the 8 meters experiments, we evolve in the 8 meters environment, but we take it out and test if it actually works in a small environment. So that's where the success rate comes from. So let's jump to the other topic of this paper, which is the GPU implementation. And the insight is basically simple, because the GPU processor cores have reached such a high complexity that we can actually do a full simulation of a robot on a single thread on a GPU. So basically, what we do is that on a thread, we have the sensor update, so basically detecting distances to obstacles. We have a controller update, that's the neural network update. We update how the robot moves, and we check for collisions. And all this is done in one thread on the GPU. And for this example hardware, my laptop has an NVIDIA T1000 graphics card, and it has 896 CUDA cores, of which each have 32 threads. So basically we have 28,672 threads, and an amazing amount of computing power available here. And then of course we can easily evaluate the entire generation in parallel on this single GPU, which speeds up things dramatically. So basically, if we run the evolutionary setup we saw before for 200 simulated seconds, it takes a full evolutionary run. It can be performed in 2.6 seconds. So already remarkably fast compared to hours or days for arguably also much more complex setups, but at least 2.6 seconds makes it really practical to work with this evolutionary setup. So one thing one can note, of course, is that what takes time is to the simulated evaluation time for each individual. So if we could go down, for instance, to 25 seconds of simulated time, we could reduce the run time even further, for instance, from 2.6 seconds to 0.5 seconds. And this is what we are attempting here. So basically, the idea we are using is that we try to put the robot in a task where it's likely to learn as good as possible. So for instance, these baby pictures show babies that are not learning from scratch, but they're basically put in a position where they're able to learn the task as efficiently as possible. So for the eating task, I mean, the child is constrained and can focus on the task of eating. And for walking, you can see parent is holding the baby up so she can practice walking without the risk of falling. So basically put it into situations where you're likely to be able to learn something useful. And this is what we sort of build on in our system as well. So basically what we do is that we make the starting positions a population, and basically this population is full of individuals that just represent the pose or starting pose of the robot. So that's X, Y, and theta. So where in the environment should the robot start and with which angle. And the fitness is 1 minus the fitness of the controller. So it's a co-evolutionary competitive setup we have here. And then if we run this, it shows remarkable results. So if we see this is the same table as before, but now with the co-evolutionary aspect. And here again, we can see that we are largely independent of arena size. Even for the enormous 8-meter arena, we get consistently positive results. Of course, there's some statistical outliers, but overall it actually works. The only situation where it doesn't work is when we have very short evaluation time. So when we have 12 seconds of evaluation time, there's simply not enough time for the system to run into the obstacle and turn around and get a positive experience. But from all the way down to 25 seconds, we have basically successful evolution. So basically what the system does is that the starting configuration is evolved to be right next to the wall. So the robot wakes up and has to avoid an obstacle as the very first thing and then drive away. So it doesn't spend time in the arena looking for obstacle because it's placed already at the onset of learning right next to the wall. And if we look at this, then we do get this speed up. So instead of 2.6 seconds for the complete evolutionary run, we can now do it in 0.5 seconds. And of course, this makes it super practical and energy efficient to work with evolutionary robotics. So why does it work so well when we consider the co-evolve configuration? Well, basically, I did mention it. It's because we have this differentiation where the robot is put in the most challenging position in the environment. So therefore, controllers that are able to handle this situation get selected. So there's a large pressure on solving hard problems. If we have a random configuration, then we can also cover the environment, make sure it works in all situations. And here co-evolution does the same, because if there is a place in the environment that's not covered, there and get the robot to solve it. Random configuration also prevents overfitting, and similar co-evolution also prevents overfitting, because if we start to overfit, there will be a controller not performing and the evolutionary process would move the poses somewhere else in the environment. And then reduce noise. This is not the case for random configuration. There's a lot of noise in the fitness evaluation, whereas for co-evolved configuration, once it's settled on a very hard challenge, it stays there for a long time, making sure learning takes place in this particular corner of the fitness landscape. Good. So where are we? So what are the open issues? So actually, this is an extended version of an earlier paper, and here we have shown that we can reduce the evaluation time of individuals. And it will be interesting to look at, can we also reduce the number of generations, which we have kept as a fixed parameter in this study. So we could potentially reduce the evaluation time even further with this study. So a devil's advocate regarding co-evolution would say that we are sort of choosing the worst possible configuration for the robot. And this works for our case because even the worst possible case close to the wall can be solved by the algorithm relatively easy. But for more complex setups, this may not work. So for instance, imagine a robot having to walk. We can place it in a configuration where it's almost already completely out of balance and cannot be recovered. And of course, the controllers cannot deal with that no matter what. So it's not all tasks where you can just take the most evil configuration as a starting point for learning. So basically, that leads us to this conclusion that the general challenge is to find initial configurations that are just at the right level of challenge, so we get progress while challenging the controllers. So in conclusion, we demonstrate the potential of GPU-accelerated evolutionary robotics, dramatic speed up compared to a non-parallel implementation. And we explored the potential of co-evolution of initial configuration controller. Again, we gained increased performance because we can evolve individuals with much less evaluation time. That was my paper. Thank you for listening, and I think you got an inspiration maybe for GPU-based evolutionary robotics, which I think has great potential in exploiting the resources we have now in our systems. And then, of course, this novel idea of co-evolution of the starting pose and the task to also accelerate evolution.
All right, we're back. Thank you so much, Casper. I can see there's already a question in the chat that you have answered. Would you like to elaborate on that? So Russell is asking, is individual fitness function evaluation the same for each individual, so there is no imbalance in the parallel algorithm? Yes,
I think I already answered, but I guess a key comment is that the GPU cores are now so advanced that you don't have to run the same code in all threads. So actually there can be differences, but in my case, there's no difference. So I think a lot of what I'm saying in my talk is that the GPU cores are now such complex computational units that anything you can do on the main CPU, you can also do on a GPU with some more complexity involved. So you can get this kind of speed up.
Thank you. Do we have other questions? Otherwise, maybe I can ask, what would be the future perspectives of this project?
So I think there are two aspects. So I think for the GPU-based evaluation, I think it's the future aspect is that maybe more can think about this. I mean, I think many people are running using OpenAI, Gym, and these kind of tools, but they're not really parallel by nature. So I think a lot of simulation systems can be made parallel, and that would help for evolutionary robotics. So I think that requires some further work. Hopefully, this work I did here can inspire people to go in this direction. And for the co-evolution, it's of course interesting to look at more complex tasks. So can we evolve locomotion? Because maybe something like walking is not about walking, but it's about avoiding the situation where you're almost falling. So that maybe this can be something that we can do with our co-evolutionary system.
Right. Thank you. Is there any other questions? We have 2 more minutes. Would you, then I will ask another one. Would you consider, so placing the robot at the beginning in a space where it is already near an obstacle, would you consider it a bias in the learning of the robot?
Yes, of course, but I think the environment is interesting because it's largely empty. So there's not much to be learned in most of the environment. So the only place where learning takes place is if you are close to an obstacle, because that's where you can differentiate the good or the bad controllers from each other. So of course, we may be biasing learning a lot, but we are basically filtering the environment a little bit. So the robot is guaranteed to get an experience from which it can learn. Whereas normally, if you just place the robot randomly in the environment, then most of the time it will not hit an obstacle, and therefore it will never learn anything. So the trial is basically lost. That's the idea behind this kind of algorithm.
I see. Okay. Thank you so much.
Thank you. We'll see you again.
Yeah. We go on then with the next talk. That would be by Mia Catherine Baslum. Yeah.
Hello.
Hi, Mia. Would you like to try your screen share?
Yeah. So now you should be able to see it.
Yes, perfect. So the stage is yours. Thank you.
Okay. Right. Yeah, my name is Mia, as I said. No, she said. And I will start by explaining my work on centralized and decentralized control in modular robots and their effect on morphology. And I hope you can see my my pointer here. That's good. So the problem, sometimes it can be very challenging to design controllers when co-optimizing modular robots, because the number of inputs and outputs will change drastically between different robots and the morphologies as they evolve. And some option for this is the centralized control, where you have one network that controls the entire robot. This has the benefit of internally synchronizing the different modules, which is good for task execution. However, it has the disadvantage that it scales as the network grows. It can become quite large with a lot of parameters. And the design is also not very obvious, as it can be a fixed size, which has a host of problems that I will discuss, or it can grow with the morphology, which is also not very easy to do. The other way is the decentralized control, which is when you have a bunch of control units and you put them in every single module. This is much easier to implement. However, it has the same problem of scalability with parameters growing. There is also no inherent synchronization, although you can have it through coupling. So our contribution to this is to investigate the centralized and decentralized controllers, some of them that we implemented. And in the process of this, it was a bit more of an investigative process. We ended up suggesting a control strategy that is based on reusing control units across the morphology. So in specific, we will focus on comparing these controllers based on the effect it has on the morphology. And specifically, we look at the early convergence of morphology here, exemplified by Nick Cheney's figure, where you have that very often in co-optimizing the morphology and control, the morphology is decided early on, and the rest of the run is spent on optimizing the controller in small tweaks. So I'll just go into the system. It'll be very rapid fire, I'm sorry. So we're using the modular robot Emerge. It has sensors on both the sides and the top, as you can see here. The environment is something that we built in Unity. It is just a flat plane. And Python we use to hold the evolutionary loop, and we communicate with the Unity executable through ML Agents Toolkit. I use a direct encoding. So in Python, the body of the robot and the controllers inside the body is represented as a directed tree. And I allow there to be collisions in the genome. These will later be pruned in Unity. As you can see, the collision is here. And right before the simulation is activated, the collisions are removed. The evolutionary algorithm is a standard EA. It has tournament selection, mutation, evaluation, and then generational replacement. So we don't keep any elites. And the fitness function is simply to walk as far away from the origin as possible in the horizontal plane within an allotted time of 20 seconds. So that was sort of the general setup. It is a bit standard, which is on purpose to control for the controllers. So there are 4 controllers in our system. The first one is based on a sign generator. This is our baseline. It shows the minimum expected control. And the other 3 are based on a continuous, or they use a continuous time recurrent neural network, which we chose to have dynamic temporal behavior. And I will also now go through all of the 4 controllers, presenting them very shortly. This is a bit simplified. The baseline controller is the sine controller, which works by having sine wave generator in every single module. The centralized CTRNN controller is a fixed size CTRNN of 45 inputs and 15 outputs that map to every module. The decentralized CTRNN controller has small CTRNNs with 3 inputs and 1 output that all map to a module. And then the last controller is the copy CTRNN controller, the one we suggest based on reusing. And instead of having as many networks as there are modules, we only have 2, no matter the size of the robot. These are then copied into the different modules in the body at different places at the start of an evaluation. And they then function independently based on sensor inputs. So we also had to tune the different controllers to compare them effectively. We tune the control and morphology mutation rates. So we did this on generations of 50, on population sizes of 50. And for all of the 64 squares for each controller, we had 4 runs. And what we discovered is that there was a lot of variation, especially in the decentralized and the copy controller. So instead of just picking a square that did well, this could lead to a bad square being picked because there's a lot of variation. We chose instead to collapse the columns and collapse the rows so that we could get a better sense of each parameter and more data for that parameter. So the final runs were done on generations of 500. So we just ran them for longer, same population size. And there were 64 runs per controller. And you can see here the fitness on this axis and the generation on this axis. We saw that the copy CTRNN controller significantly outperformed the other controllers. So these controllers were not significantly different from each other. However, we also saw that the centralized and the sign controller, the green and the yellow here, they converged a lot quicker than the copy and the decentralized CTRNN controllers. The distributions are also very interesting. So as we mentioned, we had a lot of variation in the copy and the decentralized. And this is seen in this very flat distributions for these 2, compared to the centralized and sign, which have very narrow and concentrated distributions. So they reliably did well. While the decentralized and copy had some fallers here, you can see there's a very clear distinction where there are falling robots. And there are also some in the sign, very few in the centralized. We also checked the morphology sizes and their fitness. So morphology size is the amount of modules you have for each controller. So we have the fitness on this axis and the number of modules, which is the size on this axis. And what we saw is that the sign and the centralized controllers, these 2 here, have very small morphologies and are reliably pretty good, while the copy and the decentralized had larger individuals, above 10, as you can see here, but only the copy did well with larger morphologies. We also check the beneficial morphology changes. This is when a morphology change occurs in the evolution and it is beneficial to the individuals so that this becomes the new elite of that run. And this is on this axis. And then we also plot this for the 100 intervals. And we have 500 generations, so that's 5 intervals. Because of course there's only one beneficial morphology change that wins around or a generation. So what we see here is that the copy controller consistently had more beneficial morphology changes throughout the runs, and they do in fact experience beneficial morphology changes all up until the end. So I'll start by summarizing the conclusions that we came to, starting with the effectiveness of the copy controller. And I'll consider the 2 aspects of controller mutation and morphology mutation. Comparing the decentralized CTRNN controller to the copy, because these 2 are very similar to each other. And in the case of a controller mutation, you see that if the controller mutates in the decentralized case, you get that only one module is affected. While in the copy, because there are clones of this one controller all over the body, most of the body could be affected by this. And this means that the copy controller is very limited in the amount of behaviors it can express. It has fewer parameters by far. This means that it is not able to fine tune, which leads it to sort of rely on morphological exploration in order to improve, instead of fixating on local optima or tweaking the controller in small ways to sort of get to a very small improvement. In the morphology mutation case, you can see here that from the left example, I've added a module. You get that in the decentralized, the module will inherit the control of the parent. So it will get a controller that works, or at least is functional in some way, but maybe not in this position. While in the copy case, this will also happen. However, this controller has been optimized to work in all of these different positions, and some of them being similar to the one that it's now in. It's more likely to work, which makes the morphology mutation less deleterious and makes it more likely that it will explore the morphological space. So if we compare it further to the naive decentralized CTRNN, we see that the naive decentralized has a more complex optimization, which leads to a fixation on the local, where you have, for example, in this robot, that only 2 of the modules move while the rest are completely static, which doesn't have the time to optimize the entire robot. While the copy controller moves most of its modules at once, which gives it an advantage in terms of force, because it has more force, it can move further. So the centralized CTRNN and sign controller had a problem with local optima solutions. I'm just showing some of them here. My data is completely filled with this one. And this is a problem of early convergence of morphology, which in this experiment we can say is definitely a problem with the controller because we controlled for it. And it shows a lack of robustness to the morphological change from the controller side. So you have that, for example, the centralized CTRNN, because of the way the outputs and inputs map to modules. When you add a module, there are sometimes that the inputs and outputs will shift a little bit, and this fully scrambles the control, which really discourages morphological exploration. And this doesn't happen in the decentralized case because there is an inherent modularity that stops this from happening. So some of the limitations of this work is obviously the centralized controller implementation leaves a little bit to be desired, and it would probably be better to have it grow with the morphology, although it is very interesting to see how the fixed size has this effect on the morphology and the lack of morphological exploration. It would be better to have it grow and compare the growing version to the copy controller. Maybe even have a growing topology that sort of follows a copy controller scheme. We also had some problems with realism, that our robots were a bit too strong, no matter how much I tweaked it. And the sensors were a bit unrealistic as they could capture all distances, and most sensors don't do that. So in short, this would probably benefit from being checked on a different system with different quirks than ours. So in conclusion, we investigated the centralized and decentralized controllers. And in the process, we ended up suggesting a controller that is based on reuse and control units across the morphology, the copy controller. And the copy controller also is a case or advocating for duplication and control in general, because we see that this furthers morphological exploration and it has a chance of higher fitness. We also looked at the early convergence of morphology and specifically how the design of centralized and centralized control could make early convergence more likely, and how it could be not done then. So I don't know if I went really fast or really slowly, but thank you for your attention.
It was very good timing. And thank you so much for your talk. Very interesting. So we will have 5 minutes of questions now. I can see Casper raising his hand already. Please give it a go.
Yes, hello. Thank you for the nice talk. I was just wondering what happens when the modules touch each other or collide with each other, because clearly when you copy the controller, then it's not always suitable. So how do you simulate that, or how is that done in the simulation?
Wait, so they're copied into, I'm sorry, I'm not sure what you mean.
Oh, I mean that you have controllers that are not perfect for one specific module, so therefore it would do erratic behavior. So maybe a leg would touch another leg and make the robot stumble. Is this simulated in your system?
Yes, it is just simulated as it would happen, then that happens.
Okay.
It's just a physical simulation.
Okay. So there's a risk that if you run it on a physical system, then the modules may get injured or
yes.
Yeah. Okay. Yes. Okay. Thank you.
It's all done in simulation, and I think a lot of what happens there would very much damage the modules.
Yeah, no, for sure. Thank you.
Thank you. Do we have other questions? Then maybe I can ask a very naive question. How do you measure the distance moved by these modules? Because I could see some of them spinning around or...
Yeah, so the fitness function in short, it's like if you see, I can probably show you on the robots here, the root module is the one that is tracked. And so 2 seconds after the simulation starts, the position of the root module is recorded. And then after 18 seconds, I do believe, the position is recorded again. And the difference between those are calculated, and that's the fitness. So it's only the position in the XY plane and not in the Z direction.
Okay, I see. And the time has been fixed, or have you tried different longer times, or the 18 seconds?
Like the interval at the start, the 2 seconds, I tested a bunch because I had problems with the robots falling, and having a start period is usually what you do to avoid that, but no amount of doing any change to that would make them not fall. Some of them learned to sort of stabilize until they could fall. So there was a lot of, yeah.
I see. All right. Thank you so much. Do we have other questions? All right. So thank you, Mia, for your talk. And next speaker would be Aaron Hintze with a talk on testing the efficiency of a genome-wide association study on a computational evolutionary model. We have Aaron. Yes.
Yes.
Lovely. Welcome.
Cool. So I'll start. We don't wait for 10, right? Okay.
No, I think we can start. Yes. Thank you so much.
Yes. Thank you so much. I apologize for my voice being really hoarse. I have corona, so good that we're meeting online, I guess. Let me start my presentation. You can see my slides, right? Yeah. Perfect. Okay, so yeah, the title is Testing the Efficiency of a Genome-Wide Dissociation Study on a Computational Evolutionary Model. When you think about a model organism here, I just drew Drosophila, and you ask yourself, how does this work? I mean, how do genes control traits like eye color, bristles, segment formation, mating behavior, any of those things? Well, you are very much left with one method here. Seymour Benzer kind of pioneered this. The idea is that the first recessive phenotype of a gene defines its function. So what you do is you pick a mutant that is interesting in a trait that you're interested in, or affecting a trait that you're interested in. You clone the gene, you make a knockout, you determine the phenotype of that knockout. Very educational process. You typically get a PhD for doing that. And it's incredibly slow, right? It takes a PhD to do this, right? But that's the thing you do if you have a model organism, because that's where you have all those tools to do this. If you have a non-model organism, it becomes a little bit more difficult, and it becomes really difficult if you cannot do any type of genetic manipulations. For example, in humans, you can't do it. Okay. And at the same time, we're really interested in complex diseases in humans. I listed a couple of those that we would love to know how genes control them. And well, that approach doesn't work. So you need something new and better. And of course, there is something to it. When it comes to finding genes that control complex traits, there's only one, GWAS, Genome-Wide Dissociation Studies. Became super popular around 2010. We're pretty much the promise to do this. Oh, I'm not seeing my chat. I just saw that there is a chat node. I'll get to the chat later. So the problem is that after 2010, GWAS was still around, but for some reason they are not working that well. And there are lots and lots of reasons why that is, fairly interesting hypotheses. But let's look at how a GWAS works in the first place. You pretty much take advantage of diversity in the population. Here you have a group of small and a group of individuals that have a large trait. And of course, those traits are affiliated with genetic markers, or maybe even the mutations that causes those phenotypic variations. And what you do is you do a correlation analysis with all of this data, and you pretty much map the trait variation back to a site in the genome. Straightforward method. You recover pretty much immediately what we already know. Simple traits are a proof that GWAS work. And then when we get to complex traits, it apparently fails. So why is that? And as I said, there are lots and lots of reasons. And we decided, how about we try to do a positive control with as much of an advantage as possible? Meaning, let's take all the ambiguity of sequencing not right, phenotypic traits are not described properly. Let's try to do this, yeah, as I said, with as much of an advantage as possible. So we should have perfect knowledge about the genome, of course. Functions of all genes should be known. Interactions of all genes should be known. Full knowledge about inheritance of the organisms, accurately describe phenotypic traits, unlimited statistics, and of course knockouts for all genes available. And there's no natural organism that provides you this. So we use an artificial model. And I have to say, this is probably something that we wanted to do for 15 years already. This is really overdue, because if this works, this is another way of actually describing what your computational models do using an automatic method that just does this, instead of kind of going into the details and triggering out which gene does what. So in real life, you have genes make proteins, usually genes interact, there's gene regulation also happening, genes form pathways, networks, highly controlled functions, and they're responsible for phenotypic traits. Great. The computational model that we're using is Markov brains. Markov brains have a genome. The genome has genes, and in a Markov brain, each gene controls an individual deterministic or probabilistic logic gate, how it is connected and what function it does. That forms a form of neural network, and this neural network is used to control an agent. And so in that sense, we have a phenotypic behavior that we can actually quantify, because the controllers actually control that behavior. The task that we are evolving our agents on doesn't really matter. You could have picked anyone. The one that we used is a foraging task. Coincidentally, there's an area filled with grass. We put agents in the four corners of the grass and then ask them to collect the grass. I'll show you one agent foraging in this environment to illustrate what the actions and sensors are. The actions are allowing the agent to actually move forward, turn left, turn right, or do nothing. When the agent moves on another agent, it hands over a previously collected grass, and agents are allowed to blink. This is this purple blinking that you sometimes see here. And blinking, sorry, means beeping. There's a sound that they are supposed to utter. They have sensors. Agents see in front of them, and specifically what tile is in front of them, if it's empty, filled with grass, if it's a wall, if it's another agent. And agents can actually individually distinguish which other agent beeped. That's a form of communication that they have. Our genomes are standard genomes in our MAPE environment, 10,000 sites long, meaning 10,000 32-bit integers. We allow point mutations to occur and duplications, but these duplications are not insertion duplications, they're actually overriding. So that way, our 10,000 nucleotides stay 10,000 nucleotides long, because otherwise we would need to do multiple sequence alignment at the end, and we want to save us that trouble. So genomes are constant. Now, GWAS typically, or this GWAS software is, of course, tweaked to deal with ACGT nucleotides. So we take our 32-bit integers and turn them into ACGT nucleotides. So our genomes are 160,000 nucleotides long, fairly long, if you think about it. Our evolutionary optimization process is straightforward. We take an organism, make 4 clones of this organism. Think of this as an extended phenotype or a hive or a group. We put them in the 4 corners of the environment, let them forage, count which of the agents actually performed worst, meaning collected the least amount of food, and then use this number as the fitness for that particular organism, and then repeat this for the entire population over and over and over. It turns out that this is a nice way of encourage cooperation. You get fairly nice and diverse behavior, so that's why we picked this task. And as I said, it doesn't matter. You can probably use any other thing. Okay, we started evolving with 100 organisms for 5,000 generations for them to actually figure out how to solve the task. And then we go through an expansion phase over 1,000 generations where we expand the population to 10,000 organisms. Because, of course, in the end, the more organisms that you have, the better your correlations will be. And then after this expansion phase, we added another 1,000 generations for them to equilibrate at this very large population size. We start with 10 random genes. There's typically loss of genes very early on. There's a later complexification of the agents which are solving this thing. And we did 2 replicate experiments. Not necessarily because it takes long to do this. It's a 50-core computer, about 8 hours to run the whole experiment. But you have to perform the GWAS on all of them, and that's the expensive part. So we said 2 is enough. We don't want to do 15 different GWAS and cross comparison between that many. Over the course of evolution, they start out being really poor performers. They become better, and at some point they really solve the task. And I show this to illustrate that they actually solve the task already after 3,000 to 4,000 generations, much before we do the population expansion phase. So in the population expansion phase, we really inflate the population, but we're not necessarily discovering lots and lots of evolutionary novelty at that point. At the end, we are not using the 10,000 organisms to run the GWAS on. We actually take 1,000 to subsample, and you can subsample in different ways. You could, for example, pick highly related organisms. That's a really bad idea. If you do this in a GWAS, it doesn't work, but we try to replicate all the mistakes. So we also picked highly rated organisms, but we also picked highly diverse organisms and randomly to get better controls and see if the same phenomena occur that we see in other GWAS. We also find quite a bit of behavioral diversity at the end. We have agents that, eat a little and turn often. We have agents that eat more and turn somewhat often. We have agents that follow the wall or wall huggers. We have agents that actually only one organism moves and all the other 3 are not doing anything. And we have those that are really good moving straight lines, clearing this cloud. So we have to pick a couple of behavioral traits that are easy quantifiable. We picked 13 different ones: how much food they've eaten, how much they beeped, how much food they collected as a group, how much they turned left, right, how much walls they saw, how many walls they saw, and so forth and so forth. 13 quite easy quantifiable traits that we want to explain how they come about. So at the end, that means that we have a quantitative description of every of these 10,000 organisms in the population. And we do this by testing every organism 50 times to get a very accurate quantification of its behavior. And then we actually do knockouts, which means that we take all organisms knock out every gene in every organism and test its, describe its phenotype, giving this knockout. And also, just because we added, we do all possible combinations of knockouts to test epistase. I'm not going to talk about it, but we have done that as well. So at the end of all of this modeling, we have genome data, the sequences of all organisms. We know where each gene is because we implemented the code that tells us where it is. We have phenotypic data accurately describing the phenotype of every organism, and we have knockout data for every gene, for every individual, in every combination of each knockout. So of course, the genome data and the phenotypic data goes to the GWAS. The knockout data and the location of the genes is used to verify what's going on. Now, since we have perfect match here, that shouldn't be that hard, right? With great statistic, accurate description, this should totally be a walk in the park, finding out what these organisms do, right? Okay, let's look at a result, and I'm sort of showing you a mock-up here. On the x-axis, this is the genome, the 160,000 nucleotides. On the y-axis is the loss in seeing the number of walls if I knock out a particular site. So of course you have lots and lots of background noise, but if you knock out genes, and here I've sort of mocked up 5 genes, if you knock out any of those genes that are involved in actually controlling the agent behavior, you should see that they're not seeing walls as well anymore. And of course, the right axis is significance level of the GWAS. If you do your GWAS analysis on this, you should see lots and lots of noise, and you should recover most of the genes. That's pretty much the idea. We have 2 methods of doing the GWAS. There's the ANOVA method. The ANOVA method pretty much assumes that you have your 4 different nucleotides, A, C, G, and T, and you take the phenotypic variation for each of these alleles into account. And the other method is pretty much what we call the SNP method, where you assume that one of the alleles is wild type and all the other 3 alleles are mutant, but you do not distinguish between those 3 alleles. It's the SNP method. And we typically pick the allele with the highest frequency as the wild type. Okay, so when you run this experiment, you get lots and lots of graphs. This is for one experiment, 13 different graphs. Let's zoom into one more precisely. This is the one that is for picking elements. On the x-axis, again, the genome. And what you see here in gray is the genes that are actually showing effect knocking out when knocked out on picking. And you see that there are 7 genes, I think, that show effect. And unfortunately, there are only 2 columns where the GWAS seems to pick up a signal. And then you also see on top these dashed lines. These dashed lines are the required significance thresholds that you would need to hit if your GWAS would actually be allowed to identify a gene in this particular manner. And the black one is actually a lower threshold. And what ends up happening is that we're not reaching required significant levels, more or less, in most of the cases. So let's look at pooled results. On the top, you have our experiment A, and on the bottom, we have experiment B. You see the different approaches, ANOVA and SNP mapping, and then our 3 ways of selecting agents from the population, diverse, related, and random. And then 7.3 is the highest significant threshold, 5.0 is the second highest significant threshold. And best is, we basically said, screw the significance threshold. We just move the significance threshold lower and lower and lower and lower and lower until we find a true positive. And then we keep lowering until we're collecting more and more true positives, until we find the first false positive, and that's where we stop. Or until we find the first more false positive, in case you already found a false positive first. Okay, so one thing that is completely obvious is that when you look at the related columns, that it doesn't really work. And that's obviously what we know from the GWAS, so let's ignore those. The other thing that we observe is that there isn't really much difference between diverse and random. Diverse is typically a little bit better than random. We already know that from previous GWAS studies. And when you compare the 2 methods, well, SNP method has a high false positive rate, and ANOVA has a very low true positive rate. The other thing that you are seeing is that we are finding 0, 3, 1, 4, maybe 8 genes. And if we find 8 genes, we still have 38 false positive genes. That's not a lot. The expectation is that we should explain all 13 traits, or find genes explaining all 13 traits. So the minimal amount of genes that we should find is 13. If one gene is controlling one of the traits, right? This is an overlap, but you should still find those 13 at least. Yeah, we're not. And it's actually not clear why that really is. one way of thinking about how many genes we should have found is if we try to find out how prevalent each gene is in the population. So on the x-axis is the different number of genes. In experiment A, we actually have 70 genes found in the entire population of 10,000 organisms. And in experiment 2, I think we have 91 genes throughout the population. I ordered them according to this black line, and the black line shows you in how many individuals each of the genes can be found. And you see on the very right border of both plots that we have very, very few genes that can be found in all organisms. And in red, you see the effect, the mean fitness effect that happens when you knock out that particular gene. And in orange, you see the mean fitness effect when you knock out this gene only in those organisms that actually do have the gene. Okay. Point is that on the very right side, you have about 4 to 5 genes here, maybe 6, that are actually in all organisms, or in most organisms, and that do have a significant fitness effect when knocked out. And this is only for the genes that are affecting fitness. We should have found those at least because they are for sure essential genes. But as I said, no, we haven't. So our GWAS here is underperforming tremendously. So conclusion, we can replicate the phenomenon. And by that, I mean, first of all, we can run a GWAS on the system. Perfectly fine. But when replicating this problem, well, the GWAS is equally fruitless than natural GWAS, right? It's the same problem. We initially thought that this should be a walk in the park. Few genes should be found. What's the big deal? But it's apparent that our model, even though it's simple, has already sufficient complexity to serve as a control for GWAS. If we now improve either GWAS technology or how we do our modeling or anything, any of these cases should be able to tell us what can we do better when actually doing a GWAS on one hand, and at the same time, we might actually find a reason why GWAS don't really work that well. Epistatic connections, complexity, any of those arguments. However, there are also, I guess, 2 serious limitations of what we've done. We actually ran all of this on haploid asexual organisms. And when you run GWAS on real data, you actually use diploid organisms that have sexual accommodation. That's a big, big difference. Fortunately, MAPE, a modular agent-based evolution framework that we use to actually run our experiments, allows us to pretty much flip on diploid and recombination. It's already there, we just didn't do it here. And the second observation that we have, and that's really not clear where this is coming from, is that the populations that we end up having are on one hand highly diverse, and on the other hand, they're also highly related. And being highly diverse and highly related is something that you do not observe in natural populations. They typically are less diverse and less related. So maybe that's one way of explaining why this is tipped off. Anyways, I would like to thank my co-authors, Yasser Imam and Lars Renegade, and of course you for your attention. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Aaron. It was very interesting. We have a few minutes for questions. Is there anyone? Otherwise, maybe I can ask. So you said you would take into consideration point mutations in the genome, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Have you considered post-transcriptional modifications as well? So in the pathway between gene and mRNA, at some point the mRNA would get modified, nucleotides would get modified and give rise to different proteins?
Yeah, I guess the answer is sort of yes and no. The genes that we have pretty much encode logic gates, right? And each gene encodes a different logic gate. And there's no other modification, not silencing, we're not having epigenetics and so forth. Genes don't methylate, whatever, right? At the same time, since the product is a logic gate and the logic is actually computed, interacts with other logic gates, which interacts with other logic gates, of course, these logic gates have pretty much the entire power to turn each other off, to mute each other, to not compute anything, and so forth. So in that sense, I think we are recovering the complexity of a gene regulatory network or of any type of pathway. I mean, if you look at, for example, other pathways that people reconstruct, they actually sometimes describe them with using and or not and so forth, because they turn each other on and off. So that type of logic actually persists. So yes, there's no extra mechanism, but they have the functionality to do this. Since we're talking about this, because it's actually quite interesting, when we say we can make things diploid, what would happen is that you have a copy of every logic gate where it is. And since these are deterministic logic gate to a large degree, if you just duplicate a deterministic logic gate, it performs exactly the same functions. So you have no dosage issue or something like that. So it's actually really easy to turn Markov brains into diploid Markov brains, if you want. It becomes a little more interesting if you have probabilistic outcomes, because then one logic gate might say yes and one logic gate might say no. What do you do? And in this case, we typically resolve this with an OR operation. So a yes overrides a no in this particular case. So signal overrides non-signal, I guess, is the logic. So yeah, if that answers the question.
I see. Yes, indeed. Thank you so much. And may I ask, which diploid organisms have you tried so far?
We haven't. Diploid is an option in Mate that you can turn on to actually study this. I think for sure Clifford Bohm, who wrote most of Mate, actually tested this, and we have initial experiments with diploid organisms showing that it actually does that. But I don't think that we have a publication.
Okay, I see. Perfect. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
If there is any other questions, otherwise, thank you, Arne, again.
Yeah.
And we may proceed with the next speaker. And we have Vi An Han. Yeah, hi.
Hello.
Welcome.
Hi. So can I share my slide?
Sure, go ahead.
Thank you.
Yes.
Hello. Can you see my slide? Okay.
Yes, yes, it works. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you so much. I'm Thang Han from Tisa University in the UK. So I'm going to talk about our joint work with Tom Lenners, Luis Muniz-Pereira, and Francisco Santos, where we look at some mechanism for voluntary safety pledges for overcome the overregulations dilemma in AI development. Here we use this sort of evolutionary game theory and population dynamic approach to model this kind of ecosystem of different strategies when developing AI technologies. So I'm going to talk about what is the overregulation dilemma and what is voluntary safety agreement and how they can work to solve this problem. Okay, a bit of introductions. So we have seen great promise from AI. We have seen lots of deployments recently in AI, which lead to great benefits for businesses. We have seen deployment of AI in many application domains like driverless car, robotics, even autonomous weapons. And given these great expectations and potential benefits that one can derive from developing AI technologies and the potential risks that associate with these technologies, they are not developed in a safe way. We have like lots of concern from political leaders and also researchers, policymakers, that we need to think about how to regulate this the kind of risks that can happen. So in our group, we've been working on this topic for a while, and our approach is to use some sort of computational modeling, because here you have usually you don't have enough data to make any predictive model, or yeah, because given, for example, the calling bridge dilemma, where usually it's very difficult to have a policy that can catch up with the speed of development in any kind of technologies. So given the lack of data, we feel like the most sensible approach is trying to do some computational modeling, and we decided to go for evolutionary game theory and agent-based models. So one of the finding from our research is that if we, given the lack of data, and if we say, okay, we always regulate unsafe behavior unconditionally, we show that it actually can lead to this kind of over-regulation dilemma, where you can reduce the risks and the unsafe behavior in certain domain, but at the same time, it can lead to over-regulations, especially when the risk probability is high, is low. Yeah, and because we don't have for example, data about certain level of risk given a domain and given the speed of development in that domain, then it's really hard to say when we have to regulate certain technologies. So I'm going to describe our models. Here's I'm going to describe a simple model, and you can look at the full paper for several variations of the model. So here, assuming that we have a number of companies trying to develop their technologies, for example, driverless car, and they need a number of advancements to reach the supremacy, or when they can have very advanced technologies. And if they reach that, they can get a very large benefit B here. Yeah. And if you are familiar with game theory here, you can see that this needs to be modeled using a repeated game because we have a number of rounds, and the companies, for example, can look at each other's development decisions in the past and say, okay, if the other develop unsafe technologies, they ignore precautions, safety precautions, so maybe I just ignore that myself. So here, so to model that, we have say, okay, in each advancement, there's a choice. The player can play safe, meaning that they take into account safety and ethical precautions very carefully in their development, or they can ignore that completely. Of course, you can think about more continuous model where companies, for example, can kind of comply with a certain degree. But we haven't done that. That's for future work. So basically, safe option is costly and takes more time than unsafe. That's the assumptions. And here we can look at possible strategies in this kind of repeated interactions. So you can imagine you have somebody who complies completely, always develops things safely, or ignore safety precautions completely in all their development rounds. Or you can have any combinations which say, okay, I play safe sometimes, play safe the other time, but that can be conditional on the past. Yeah. So the thing here is with advanced technology, you can assume that there's risk of disaster, which is proportional to the number of unsafe developments that occur during the whole development. So it's model using this P-risk. P-risk is the probability that disaster strikes when safety precaution is completely ignored, and it just kind of be proportional given the number of unsafe or safe behaviors a player took. Yeah. And we also look at different possibilities, like the disaster strikes, then it only impacts the focal player or it impacts everyone. Yeah. And in evolutionary game theory, we need to derive this source of payoff matrix. So you can see here, if safe players play with each other, they all have to pay a cost, sharing a benefit, while the unsafe player, when playing with a safe player, they would get a larger benefit without having to pay the cost. So we have done this also for multiplayer interactions where you have multiple, companies competing with each other. So using this evolutionary game theory and this source of payoff matrix, we have shown in our paper, in our work, that we can actually answer the questions like when our regulatory actions are required. We have here very rich dynamic, for example, compared to standard social dilemmas like prisoner dilemma or the public rules game or the coordinations game. Here we have much richer dynamics. Here, for example, you have two regions here, region 1 and 3, we call it compliance zone and innovation zone, where kind of individual interest is in line with social interest, so you don't have to do anything. It's just if you make the wrong regulations here, that actually can be detrimental for the populations. The only problem here is the dilemma zone, where individual interest is in conflict with the social good. So where we need to provide suitable regulations. But the problem here is that because we don't have data, we don't know in which regions the interaction is actually happening. So that's the issues with technology regulations. We have shown, you have seen earlier that if we ignore the data, we just regulate unsafe behavior, that can lead to over-regulations in the regions where we want innovations. So in our work, we try to say, okay, what can we do? If we don't have any data, we don't know in which regions the interaction or the technology is belonging to. So what can we do? So is this kind of based on some previous work we did with social dilemmas, where we look at safety, commitment and agreement, and we try to apply that for this context and want to see what happened. And interestingly, it actually can solve the problem without any data. Yeah. So what we do here is, so before the race or the interactions, participants can choose whether to establish a safety commitment to act safely. So it's voluntary. Yeah. And sanctions, we look at both peer sanctions and institutional punishment is applied in case they do not uphold an adopted commitment. And anybody who say, oh, okay, I don't want to commit before the interactions, I can't follow the safety precautions probably because of the capacity or whatever reason, they won't be punished. Yeah. If they refuse to commit, they won't be punished, even if they are found out to do something unsafe. So the reason why this might work is that pre-commitment enables identifications of unsafe, non-committed players. Yeah. So you know now that somebody who won't be able to commit, then you can decide what you want to do with them, and why you have the capacity to punish the dishonest players. So somebody who say, oh, okay, I'm gonna play safely, sign the contract, but then they ignore that, and those can be punished. And so with that additional decision point, you can model that using in evolutionary game theory easily. You can have two types of strategies. One just, okay, I stay out of any bilateral commitment, and the other who agree to enter bilateral safety commitment before playing the game. And our analysis show that, okay, so here you have seen the previous case where there's no commitment, just regulation of unsafe behavior, why here you have sanctioning only committed unsafe players. Yeah. So you cannot punish the one that do not commit. And you can see that it actually reduce further the unsafe behavior in the dilemma zone, which is important to reduce unsafe behavior, why we don't see any over-regulation problem in the innovation zone where we want innovations. So yeah, so to conclude, so we have this is kind of our first attempt to try to create a plausible model that model the ecosystem and the dynamics of strategic behavior when developing AI technologies, especially the ones that can lead to different kinds of risks. And given that it's difficult to gather data in any kind of advanced technologies adoptions, we show that, okay, if we unconditionally, we recklessly regulate unsafe behaviors that can lead to over-regulations of beneficial innovations. And we have shown that, okay, a simple mechanism where you don't need any data, just before interactions, try to create a safety agreement, and then that actually can overcome the regulation problem easily. Okay, so here are the two papers. If you want to see more details, please. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Han. I can see we have question from Seth. What if an agent's ability to distinguish safe from unsafe behavior is noisy or imperfect, and what is the ability, and what if this ability gets slightly better whenever there is a disaster?
Yes, thanks so much, Seth. That's definitely very, very interesting and important questions here. Yeah, indeed, here we assume that it's possible to distinguish, yeah, so with sufficient cost, it's possible to find out with high enough probability that if someone is doing something unsafe. Actually, I presented here a model where you have we have a perfect kind of probability of catching unsafe behavior. But in the paper, in our analysis, we actually look at, okay, what is the probability, how high it should be that the probability of catching up unsafe behavior is required in order for this to work. Yeah. Yeah.
And
I think there's another question from Seth. Yes. Is yeah, but we also indeed, yeah, that's definitely so we model that with the big B value in the model. Of course, we assume here that the big B is very high compared to the benefit that you can gain from deploying kind of intermediate technologies. For example, of course, you can deploy the technologies before you reach this kind of the highest potential. Yeah, but it's you can play with this big B to say, okay, if the big B is not too high, then of course I think that would lead to richer dynamics. So this is a very good point. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Diane. I can see that there are a couple more questions from Jonathan. I would invite Jonathan to move them on the Slack channel, maybe. And okay, thank you again. We can
thank you very much.
proceed with the next, Peter. So we have Peter Hott with simulations of vesicular disentanglement. We have Peter or any other of the authors. Maybe not. Do we have Peter Hott? I cannot see any. Is there anyone from Peter Hott's group?
I'm trying to contact them. I didn't have any news before.
Thank you. I guess we can just wait.
As soon as I will know something, I will let you know. Otherwise, I think that in the case in 3 minutes, we will close the session if they don't answer us.
Perfect. Thank you, Silvia.
So I think we can close here the session because I'm not able to find them, and we can leave the rest of the people leave for their lunch break. So
Great.
Yeah.
Silvia?
Yeah.
Could those people that will be presenting in the next session be here at 13:50, please? So 10 minutes earlier?
Yeah, I think it's a good question.
Yep.
Yep. I will. I can try to contact them in the meantime.
Yeah, maybe they are here and hear it now.
Yeah, that of course. But otherwise, I will contact them to help you. And like this, it will be easier, and we can check if it's everybody present.
Okay. Thank you.
Perfect. Okay. Thank you all. Have a nice lunch break. See you later, or a dinner break if it's a different time in your part of the world. Yeah. Great. Thank you, Carlotta.
Bye.